So is Christmas a copy of the Roman celebration of Saturnalia? Well, after watching the empirical evidence presented in this video, you decide. To make sure that we're all on the same page, the first thing that we got to do is talk about how the Romans reckon time and their calendars, because it's different than the way that we do here in the West. So, in the calendar of the ancient Romans, the months contained three primary markers: the calends, the nones, and the ides. All right, the calends were always on the first of the month. The nones were usually on the 5th, but sometimes the 7th of the month, and the ides were on the 15th, but sometimes the 13th. All of the days after the ides were numbered by counting down toward the next month's calends. So, for our conversation, they wouldn't say December the 25th. They would say 8 days before the calends of January. Got it? All right, good. So, Saturnalia was a Roman festival dedicated to the agricultural god Saturn and was held between the 17th through the 23rd of December each year during the winter solstice. It involved gift giving, merrymaking, and role reversals. For instance, all year long at Roman feasts, a person's seating arrangement, their portions of food, and even the quality of the service offered to them were reflective of their wealth and or their social status. During Saturnalia, everyone was equal and no one was given any precedence. People who were slaves particularly enjoyed this time of the year because they could criticize and mock their masters without fear of reprisal. In fact, at the feast held in honor of the holiday, slaves sat down to eat first and were waited on by their masters. So, the primary source for the information that we have about Saturnalia comes from a Latin grammarian and philosopher named Macrobius, who lived in the 5th century. Here, Macrobius details how Saturnalia began as a single day on the 14th before the calends of January and progressed to lasting several days. In the end, it was held only on the 14th day before the calends of January. The Romans' calendar for December had the same 31 days as ours. So 31 minus 14 is 17. Therefore, 14 days before the calends of January would mean that Saturnalia began on the 17th of December. Now, early church fathers such as Tertullian of Carthage admonished Christians not to partake in Saturnalia. In his work, quote, On Idolatry, end quote, he details that participating in the festivities of Saturnalia are not befitting for Christians. But an even greater question to be answered by those who assert that Christmas is a copy of Saturnalia is why Christians who are being violently persecuted and martyred for their monotheistic faith in Jesus would adopt the pagan polytheistic celebrations of the same Roman Empire who was persecuting them. Some of the most violent persecutions took place under the Emperor Septimius Severus, who in an attempt at religious harmony proposed to bring all subjects together under the worship of Sol Invictus, or the unconquered sun. And don't worry, I'm going to totally debunk Sol Invictus as a copy of Christmas in the next video. So, Emperor Severus's policy was that all gods would be acknowledged and accepted as long as people acknowledged that the unconquered sun reigned above all. So this policy obviously clashed with two groups, the Jews and the Christians. So Severus decided to outlaw under penalty of death all conversions to Christianity or Judaism. It was during this era of persecution that the infamous martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity took place. In a true testament to the courage and resiliency demonstrated by Christians during this time, even under the threat of death, Perpetua and Felicity and their companions refused to deny their faith in Jesus. Felicity was pregnant when arrested and was afraid that her life would be spared for that reason, or that her martyrdom would be postponed and she would not be able to join her other companions. So she prayed that she would give birth prematurely. And the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas tells us that her prayers were answered and that in the 8th month she gave birth to a girl who was then adopted by another Christian woman. And when the jailer saw her moan in childbirth, they asked how she would be able to face the beast of the arena. Her reply, quote, Now my sufferings are only mine, but when I face the beast, there will be another who will live in me and who will suffer for me, since I shall be suffering for him, end quote. Does this sound like the attitude of people who would willingly embrace Roman polytheistic religious festivals dedicated to pagan gods? I don't think so. In AD 247, Rome celebrated its 1000th birthday, and it was the Christians who refused to participate in these festivities. Shortly after the celebration, plague ravaged the city of Rome. And the Romans believed that it was due to the Christians not celebrating their pantheon of gods. So in response, Emperor Decius launched an empire-wide persecution of Christians with the goal of making Rome great again by reaffirming the worship to their pagan gods. Decius had realized the futility of simply martyring Christians. Tertullian had declared that the blood of the martyrs was a seed, for the more it was spilled, the greater the number of Christians it increased. So instead of martyrdom, Decius attempted to force Christians to recant and deny their faith. This deprived Christianity of the martyrs' heroism and discouraged the spread of Christianity and restored paganism. It was during this persecution that many church members sacrificed to the Roman gods and others obtained fake sacrifice certificates to avoid persecution, and then some even fled from persecution. After Decius's reign, the church enjoyed about 40 years of peace. Now, then comes the persecution under the Emperor Galerius in the 4th century. And despite that harsh persecution, Christians still refused to worship the pagan gods. It was during this persecution that many sacred Christian books and others were ordered to be destroyed, but Christians hid them and refused to turn them over, even under the penalty of death. So, fam, what's the point of all of this? It's not just to give you a history lesson. It's really to make us think. If the Christians that were in this period underwent persecution from the Roman Empire from at least 193 AD up until the time of Constantine in 324 AD, and despite threats of persecution, prison, and even martyrdom, they showed unwavering loyalty to their faith in Jesus. The conclusion of all of this evidence forces us to believe that it is nonsensical to believe that these same Christians who withstood persecution from the Roman Empire because of their faith would turn around and abandon their faith and participate in or copy the festivals and celebrations of the pagan god Saturn. So, in conclusion, we have learned from primary sources that Saturnalia wasn't even on December 25th, and it took place from 17th through the 23rd of December. The earliest primary source that we have for Saturnalia dates to the 5th century, and we showed you 10 sources in the last video that demonstrate that Christians were already celebrating December 25th as the date of Christmas more than 2 centuries prior to that. Many historians have speculated that the elements of the Saturnalia festival had influenced Christmas. However, correlation is not causation. Just because similar traits are found between 2 distinct festivals does not mean that one directly influenced the other. That has to be proven, and there is no empirical evidence that exists that demonstrates so. All of the evidence points to a people who are resolute in the defense of their faith and gave their lives as opposed to demonstrating loyalty to any pagan deity. Taking an intellectually honest look at the evidence included in this presentation, I cannot fathom how any person would believe that Christians existing during this time would participate or incorporate the elements of the pagan Saturnalia festival into the sacred worship of their holy God. But I'll leave it to you to examine the evidence and make the decision for yourself as to what you will believe. God bless you and Merry Christmas.